Good morning, everybody, and welcome today to the Department of Education Virtual Professional Development Learning. My name is Joe Schmidt. I'm the Social Studies Specialist for the Maine Department of Education. This morning, we are lucky to have Congressional 1st District Representative Chellie Pingree to talk some civics and government with us. I'm very happy to say that she's completing the entire pack. We've had both senators now and both representatives to meet with teachers. Representative Pingree is going to go ahead and take the opportunity to talk for a little bit, but then she is more than happy to take questions. Just friendly reminders for everybody again at this time, you do not have the ability to unmute yourself, but I will change that setting when Representative Pingree is ready. And if you stick around to the end, I do have a feedback survey and contact hour for you. But with that being said, probably with no further introduction needed, I will go ahead and turn it over to Representative Chellie Pingree, Maine's 1st Congressional District Representative. Welcome, Representative.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you to everybody who is here this morning. I appreciate you taking your time to chat with me, and I'm looking forward to the questions or thoughts that all of you may have. I should say at the outset, I have incredible admiration for teachers. I have been a school board member. I've been a mother, so my kids have gone to school, and I know how big of a job that is, especially anyone who's a middle school teacher out there. And then I was a student myself, and I'm just going to admit at the outset, I was kind of a bad student. So I know how much teachers struggled just getting me to the finish line. So, but I'm here. And I actually thought I would be a teacher one day, so maybe everybody has one of those stories, but I was a student at College of the Atlantic in Bar Harbor, and I went there. They give a degree in human ecology, but also they had a teaching program, and I thought, well, I'll learn about science, and then I'll become a teacher. But I got very engaged in food and agriculture. My work-study job was growing plants and running the composting operation, and at some point I realized, like, whoa, teaching's really hard. I think I'll just stick with the farming stuff, and I've been there ever since. So, oh yeah, I know. I had one other thought. I think that as a politician, going to speak to your classes, and it doesn't matter if they're like the kindergartners or the 10th graders, are some of the toughest appearances that we do. Like if I go to speak to the Rotary Club, you know, they're always very polite and they ask, you know, sort of adult questions, even if they completely disagree with you. Whereas little kids are like, you know, do you have a helicopter? How come you're wearing that? Or, you know, there's just nothing that holds them back, you know, and I really appreciate that. But it also reminds me that every day you're dealing with a whole bunch of young people who are just going to say whatever they think at any moment in time. And that's what's great about kids. So I can tell you a little bit about my job, or obviously talk about the political situation right now. I think sometimes it's just a tiny bit helpful to say how I ended up here. I think often people think that you grow up wanting to go into politics, then you go to law school, and then you run for office. And I didn't grow up even thinking vaguely about serving in political office. I didn't go to law school, and it was just like a lot of times, it's sort of like the last thing you expect to do. I actually came to Maine when I was a teenager, and that's an important truth to mention because I'm from Minnesota, not Maine, and that's, you know, always got to be something you live down the rest of your life. But I've been here most of my life, and my children and grandchildren have been born here, so that's the best I can do so far. But I was sort of a back to the lander. I was a little bit interested in like how you grow food and, you know, living sustainably, and went to College of the Atlantic, I live on the island of North Haven, so I live in a tiny little town. And eventually, after being in this town long enough, got elected to the school board. I think it took maybe 15 years before I was like even eligible to do that. And I just loved it. I love being on the school board. I mean, I know that's, you know, sometimes school boards aren't the easiest people for teachers to deal with, but it was the idea of small town politics. You didn't know anybody's party. You're dealing with some of the toughest issues. People had to pay their property taxes to fund the schools, so it's sort of a hot button thing. You got to balance the budget. You got to find the best teachers for your kids. Anyway, I just loved it because we had all these different people with different ideas and managed to find a way to come together. And for me, that was like, okay, this is what democracy is. It's, this was long before cable news and all the nastiest today, but I love that. But that's all I ever really thought I would do. Fast forward, I ran a small farm and I had a vegetable stand. And one day, somebody who I had met at the vegetable stand, who had come, to the island in the summer, said, "We can't find a candidate for Knox County for the state senate. And would you ever do that?" And to tell you the truth, I had no idea. I had never been involved in partisan politics in the state. I really didn't know that much about how the state legislature worked. But it just kind of hooked me a little bit because I love this idea of being on the school board, and I was on the school board at the time. Anyway, it was an eye-opening experience because I learned all the things I had to do. Knocked on thousands of doors just to get people to even know who I was. Ended up running in Knox County at the time, was a very Republican district, and I'm a Democrat. So lots of things have happened since then, but I got to serve in the legislature for 8 years. My daughter followed me into the legislature in 8 years, nothing she ever expected to do. And then eventually I made my way to Congress. So I've been for 10 years, and feel really fortunate to have been able to work on the issues that I've worked on, even though it's a highly frustrating time for Americans who look at Congress and feel like we don't get enough done. It's a frustrating time to be a member of Congress. It's a tenuous time for our democracy as we worry about, the challenges that are facing us. And then here we are in the middle of the pandemic. And obviously this is nothing like anybody ever expected. And while I'd rather be serving in the easy times when we could be working on the issues that we care about, we could all be agreeing on it, it's kind of like if you were a physician, you don't get to just sign up to take care of the healthy patients. You got to be here even when things are falling apart and there's a lot of bad news. So it's a really interesting time to be doing the job, even though, as you can see, most of us are like everybody else. We just work out of our homes. We can't even congregate with our staff in our offices. We go to Washington on a very, very limited basis so far. But we're busy all the time. I mean, this goes on all day long in my life, as well as just, trying to figure out what should be in the next funding package, how to solve these incredible problems of testing and adequate equipment, and, how do we make the next steps? They're just really, really huge challenges, obviously life and death challenges, huge impacts to our economy that we've never faced before. So we're just completely unprepared for what's the right way to go about trying to support people or fix that. But very interesting, and I think a real privilege to be one of the people who gets to be a part of that, and think about it every day. So I can tell you more about as an actual member of Congress, I serve on the Appropriations Committee. That's kind of what everybody strives to do. Appropriations is the committee that funds everything that government does. So it gives you a chance to have a little bit of a finger in all of the funding decisions that we make, and a lot of policy decisions are based on our funding decisions. Within the Appropriations Committee in the House, we have subcommittees, and almost all our work is done in a subcommittee. So my two subcommittees are the Subcommittee on Agriculture and the FDA. So that covers everything around the USDA, all agricultural programs, food and nutrition programs like SNAP and WIC, and then the FDA, obviously, drug testing and drug research, and a lot of food safety issues. My other committee, where I'm the vice chair, is the Interior Appropriations Committee. So the Department of Interior has oversights of all the public lands in the United States. We have very little public land in New England and the East Coast, but as you know, in the West, sometimes half of a state can be publicly owned land. It also includes the national parks, oversight of the national parks, all of our national museums, the Smithsonian and other museums, and all the funding for the arts, NEA and NEH, all policy related to tribes and Indian country. And finally, the EPA. So it is definitely the Environmental Committee. So extremely contentious, always at odds with this particular administration. And, an awful lot of important work goes on there too. A lot of our work is temporarily on hold, in a sense, as we work on these big packages to support the country, but we are just about to kick back into gear because the Appropriations Committee has to put out a bill every year to fund the government. And you hear about this a lot because we'll start talking about the government shutdown. The government shuts down on the last day of September. That's our end of our fiscal year. And so if we haven't passed the funding bill for the next year, that means we're at some kind of a gridlock. And sometimes we'll do a short-term extension. And other times, as you see, we'll come to disagreement with the administration, and we go into some kind of a disastrous shutdown, which is never good for the country, never good for the Congress. It's just bad all around. But they can last for a couple of days while we scramble to get it right, or they can last for days and days and days, as they have. So that's kind of where I am. And why don't I just start taking questions and see what you're thinking about. I'm happy to talk more about anything really that interests you.
Does anybody have a question for Representative Pingree?
I can make my day easy.
Sonia, I see you waving. No, I'm trying to screen all the screens. I'll ask one. I will always ask a question. All right, so Representative Pingree, you talked about like the FDA and stuff like that. I know in the news there's been a lot of stuff around like pork factories and stuff like. Oh, I'm sorry, Leslie. I gotcha. Okay, somebody finally said you guys have the ability to unmute yourself, but I will go ahead and ask the first question since I already started. I forgot to turn that setting off. Where do you balance, Representative Pingree, there's the question around like the pork facilities where there's different infection rates and stuff like that. Where do you find a balance between the food supply and public health?
Yeah, that's very critical. And that's an issue that I'm very close to right now. So oddly enough, in our system, fresh fruits and vegetables and the safety of fresh fruits and vegetables are regulated by the FDA. They're all come under a bill that we call the Food Safety Modernization Act, FSMA, which is actually, it applies quite a bit to Maine farmers because it's a recent piece of legislation. So if you have a farm stand or anything, you have to meet some of those new standards, and it has been a little bit onerous. But the question that you've asked me is about meat. And so all meat is regulated by the USDA. It's a ridiculous segmentation of government that we've tried to put back together. This particular situation right now with the president using the Defense Production Act to reopen the slaughterhouses is a cause of great concern. And I was on a call. I'm on the Agriculture Committee as well as Agriculture Appropriations. And 2 days ago, we were on the phone with Sonny Perdue, who's the Secretary of Agriculture, and the entire committee right after the president made his announcement. So you can imagine there were a lot of differing points of view. For the members of Congress who represented tremendous numbers of pork producers or other meat producers, they were really agitated that, as you know, because of reduced slaughterhouse capacity and some of the slaughterhouses who had already voluntarily closed due to the large numbers of people who have been infected in the slaughterhouses, there's a real slowdown in processing meat. And our food system today is operated in such a way that it's very consolidated, and most producers in sort of big ag, as we call it, probably not the same as anybody who lives down the road and raises 10 pigs a year in parts of Maine, but in big ag, piglets are born and raised, and they come onto the end of the line in somewhat like a factory setting, and then the day comes that they got to go to the slaughterhouse, they have to go because there's more pigs kind of moving in behind them. So we've ended up in this situation with limited capacity, and tragically, farmers being in the situation where they literally, as they said on the phone, had to depopulate their herds. So that means we're actually disposing of pigs that could be going into the food chain that people need because they're going hungry, but there's no slaughterhouse capacity and the farms themselves can't accommodate them. So it's a real live issue. But then, as you know, in places like Sioux Falls, South Dakota, they become hotspots because of limiting testing, limited protective gear. That particular facility, that's a Smithfield facility, it's owned by the Chinese, has over 5,000 workers, many of them immigrants, and they work long hours on the line, and they are just side by side. So it's almost impossible not to have the spread of the virus. Plus, many of them live in less spacious housing conditions, so they're often, at home, bringing it home. They can't get very far away from their family or anyone else they're living with. So It's a very bad situation. And the governor of South Dakota was the one who originally closed that plant. So you've got this situation where we should have a very long time ago designed better safety conditions at our slaughter facilities. But there's been a lot of resistance to that, as you can kind of imagine how it works. We get lobbied by big meat, the big companies who don't want to change their processes, and we fight to do it differently. But here we are, sort of caught by it. And I think because many of the farmers themselves or the owners of the big facilities, the two biggest owners in this country are Brazilian and Chinese, lobbied the president to open them back open. And okay, so maybe there's some argument for that meat is vital in the supply chain, and we were eventually going to see a shortage. But on the other hand, one of the things that we were very angry about in talking to the secretary on the committee, on the committee call, was the president opened them up, but did not require reasonable safety standards. So to just say everybody's got to go back to work or else, this is a vital human resource, or this is a vital emergency service, but not say we're going to try to keep you safer, is just a recipe for more spread of the disease. Those communities become hotspots, and they're not New York City. I mean, Sioux Falls, South Dakota was one of the lowest incidence states until this happened. And it's not just the people who work in the plant. Everybody encounters everybody in a small town, and it's very hard to stop the spread of the disease. So it's hard to see what happens here. I've been kind of on a rant about that, but one last thing. One of the reasons the president used the DPA is because he has the ability to limit the liability of the plant owners, which is about as egregious as it gets, in my opinion, because then he's saying, you have to go back to work. I'm not requiring any particular safety standards of the owners, and they'll be reduced. Their liability will be limited or reduced completely if you get sick or get injured in this plant. So it just doesn't get any worse than that. And the truth is, we're experiencing an extreme hardship for many of those farmers who can't process it. It's an untenable situation that you're slaughtering hogs that don't actually go into the food supply, but we're still exporting a fair amount of pork. So we are not yet at a situation where people would run out of meat to eat in this country. And so it's just questionable that we're going to put all these people's lives on the line because of a momentary decision by the president. So I think that was like a 10-minute answer, but you just happened to catch me on something I'm in the middle of right now.
Well, no, it was fascinating because I didn't know where all the committees and stuff where you sat. And so I think you did a great job of showing like all those connections, right? Because it's not just a simple yes or no answer, but there's so many politics and other safety health issues. Other questions, otherwise I do have a couple of questions in the chat. Would anybody like to unmute and jump in? All right,
I do, Joe. Sorry. Representative Pingree, are you seeing some dialogue coming up about possible COVID infection in our meat supply? Because I know some domestic animals are starting to test positive, and I'm wondering about connections there and what you all talk about in your committee discussions.
It's a really good question. And as far as we understand, there's no ability to spread it through meat. Well, some diseases, we have worried about the transmission between humans and animals. I think that's true of avian flu, but so far there's no understanding that the pork, the meat itself, would be a carrier, even if people in the plant would be infected. I think part of it has to do with how long the virus actually stays on a surface, and food isn't a very hospitable surface to the virus. And by the time it gets from this particular facility, spends a lot of time in a really cold environment and gets to you. I've seen almost, guarantees that you won't get it from the food. But it's a good question, yeah.
And Representative, there was a follow-up question. Somebody said that employees at Barber Food here in Maine have tested positive. Do you know how that is being handled?
I know a little bit about it, and that's a good question, and certainly there are some parallels. I have visited that facility and I have worked with them many times over the years, and they do slightly, that's not a slaughter facility. As many of you know, that they produce this kind of like a banquet kind of chicken, chicken with something inside of it with crumbs outside that you put in the oven and then you cook it at home. Or they sell it to food services. So sometimes you go to a dinner at the Holiday Inn and everybody's having chicken and they came from there. So, so they are in a meat processing, but they're not in a slaughterhouse situation, and have already, really over the years enhanced their safety practices. That said, this is what we know about the virus, is that when people congregate, I mean, it's why you guys aren't in school. It's why we can't have people mingling together in a break room, in a classroom, and working too closely at work. So that's just a ripe situation for something like that to happen. And I'm not surprised. It doesn't necessarily reflect unhealthy conditions there, but I know that I'm pretty sure today, Dr. Shaw has directed a team to go in there and test. I feel like it's 400 employees or something. They're trying to get every employee tested, which this is 180 degrees from what I was describing is going on at the slaughterhouses. They have no mandate to test, and they have not agreed to do any testing. In fact, we're not allowing testing for a while. But so I think that in this case, our CDC is handling it in the best possible way. They identified the 8 people who had the disease. They're doing a lot of contact testing with them because they came from different communities, probably mostly within the Portland area, going back and finding who their family members are and attempting to quarantine everybody who would have had contact with one of those people. But they are also testing everybody in the facility, which is exactly what should happen in a case like this. We've had a real shortage of tests, and that's been a roadblock to doing this. But I really appreciate that CDC has made this a focus, because otherwise they would become the same kind of facility where suddenly everybody had it, and everybody goes home to a family member, a next door neighbor, a friend, stops in the grocery store. I mean, that's how this disease gets spread so rapidly. So let's hope that kind of responsible way to go about doing it will allow them to define who has it, who doesn't have it. And I'm sure they're doing a thorough, I'm going to find out a little bit more about it later today, but I'm sure they're doing a thorough analysis of, assuming that they keep the plant working and don't shut it down for a couple of weeks, are they going to have the best of all safety practices? Sometimes you just have to change the way people contact each other. Like I said, don't go into the same break room, have enough distance at the, stations people work at, or at plexiglass walls, make sure everybody has a mask on, all those things that we're learning that will become, part of our new abnormal future life. But some of them, are simple enough, they're worth the sacrifice to make sure we can go ahead and move forward in normal life, normalish life.
Any questions from the group? Anybody want to unmute themselves? I do have a question in the chat. Representative, how do you balance your own personal beliefs with the beliefs of Maine's diverse views when you're having to cast a vote?
It's a really good question, and I feel like it's sort of a philosophical question that always is part of a life of a person who works in public policy or politics. I mean, the good news is that Maine is a very diverse state, and it doesn't really matter if you're in the first or second CD. We're both a combination of about a third Republicans, a third Democrats, and a third independents. And independents can be, libertarian, get all government out of my life, or they can be Green Party, why doesn't the government fix everything in our lives? And there's that whole range in the parties as well. And so I know that of the 650,000, 700,000 people I represent, all views are represented. And I know it from being there long enough to know that, if we're talking about the Affordable Care Act in my first couple of years, we get 50 calls on this side and 50 calls on that side. And, for most issues, there's a range of calls, emails, letters, or just concerns that people voice to me individually. When I first got elected, because I had such a Republican district, Knox County at the time was 40% Republican, 40% independent, and only 20% Democratic. I met people who were kind of like advising me. I was 38, I'd never been in politics, and they were saying, this is going to be a tough seat for you. So you should be strategic about your votes. You should, vote with the chamber for a while, and then vote with the liberals, vote for labor, vote, with the Greens, then vote for, and they were just being like, sort of make sure you've got a vote that makes everybody happy. And you can do that, and some people are very strategic in that way, but it didn't take me very long to figure out, like, well, that is so much work. It's kind of like, like covering up a lie in a way. It's just so much easier to tell the truth than to remember what you lied about, because then you got to lie again, and then somebody else, it just gets so complicated. And I didn't mean to completely dismiss that as lying, but I just realized that for me, I don't have that kind of ability to keep track of all that in my brain. And frankly, after a while, I just said, hey, I just got elected because people decided they wanted to elect me. And I have a view on all these things. I was a small business owner at the time, but I paid my employees more than minimum wage, and I covered them all with health insurance. And that's what I thought was important. So when I get up and speak to a chamber group, I'd say, look, I'm in business too, but here's why I think it's important to give people above the minimum wage, and why you need to cover people with health insurance, and why people should have, paid leave if they need to stay home and take care of a sick kid. And it was just who I was. And I can distinctly remember in my second year, some older guy, very conservative, got up and he said, well, hey, young lady, I was kind of young then. He'd be like, hey, young lady, I don't really agree with you, but at least you tell what's the truth, or at least you say what you're really doing and what's on your mind. And I've come to observe that over the years, that people, frequently will say that about someone. Like, people will say, I didn't agree with everything about John McCain, God rest his soul, but he always was sort of out there with what he believed. And we tend to do that about politicians, especially in this era where there's just a lot of kind of controlled speech. You learn your sound bites and then you repeat the message and all that other stuff. And it's just not why I'm here. So my goal is just to make my own decisions of what I think is right. I certainly listen to, I know the issues of Maine well. I'm here every weekend. I'm very much in contact with what people say. But if I don't agree with kind of one point of view, even if it makes an interest group mad, or, I'm going to have to deal with the fallout of it, I feel like it's just a lot easier to explain why you came to the opinion that you did than, craft a message around what somebody wanted you to think to keep them happy. And in the long run, we're here as long as the public believes we're doing the job they want us to do. And it's a huge privilege, and I'm grateful to do it. But, I'm a organic farmer by trade. I own a small restaurant, and I'm an excellent bartender. I mean, I got a lot of backup skills. So, I don't mind, I'm not worried that my identity goes away, or I would, I couldn't scrape by a living or something else if this didn't work out. So yet another long speech for me, but that's how it is.
Other questions for the representative? And I do see there's one in the chat, but I'll give anybody who wants to unmute a chance.
Yeah, I have more of an observation, and you being an environmentalist, I'm wondering if you've kind of seen these observations, or what your thoughts are. This week, my students were talking about the wildlife and how sheltering in place and social distancing is actually, we've seen, an increase in wildlife, but we were more shocked with the difference in the pollution, air pollution dropping in a month's time. And I'm just wondering if, well, I'm sure you're observing it as well, but I'm wondering, in your position, is there anything we can do moving forward to see something like that continue? Because it's been amazing to see how much the air pollution has dropped. But I know when we go back to real life, everything's just going to pop back up into more air pollution.
Right. No, it's really amazing. And I love hearing people talk about that. And I love the idea, let's be clear, not everybody can stay home, and there's a lot of people extremely challenged by this situation. So it's hard to call anything a silver lining when people are, losing their health and hard things are happening. But if there is a sort of grayish lining, it's, people are staying home. People are watching spring emerge in Maine in a way they never did before. People hear birds in the morning because they're not, running to their car and starting it up and getting on the highway. And as you said, the air is much cleaner. And you look at pictures of metropolitan areas, and it's just shocking, how great that is. And people see deer in their front lawn. And although I have to go out and yell at mine and say, like, stop eating my plants, get out of here. But I think the really important thing is, we were on the verge of introducing the climate change bill in Congress when this started to happen. It was literally due to come out, I think, the last week in March. And I had written a big section of it about the relationship of agriculture to climate change. And I think, for those of us who aren't, who don't disagree with this notion or don't think we can ignore it, that's a really important problem. And yes, we're in a hiatus. We're using so much less fossil fuel. We're not moving around. A lot of very good things are happening, but we can allow ourselves to go back. I mean, I don't know. It will be tragic if we're allowed to go back to exactly everything the way we used to do it, and aren't willing to get back onto the track of how do we make sure we're prepared for the next crisis, because that could very well be a much more dangerous and damaging and life-threatening crisis if it continues to impact, the temperatures, the wildfires, the droughts, the famines, whole sections of the world that can't feed themselves anymore. So, this will seem like quite minor. I think that, I don't, it's such a new, experience for all of us. I'd like to think that human nature says, hey, wait a minute, I kind of liked what it was like when things slowed down a little and we didn't all consume so much and we weren't all so busy and, driving all the way. I do think naturally we're not going to, even if we start to open up the state, they're not going to rush to drive their family all over the country because they're still not going to be sure it's okay. They're not going to get into big stadiums right away because they're not going to be sure it's okay. So some of these things I think are going to still stay away from our lives, and hopefully we'll keep remembering the things that we like. But my biggest hope is that, and I don't have any way to judge this, but is that we come out of this understanding the role of science. We have become so cavalier about science because it's gotten all mixed up in politics in the last decade and more. But, everybody's been allowed to say, like, there are no facts. I don't believe those facts. And, just because it says you're a scientist, I know this other guy who saw this thing on the internet who says that's not true. And, if there's one thing we're hopefully learning about this is, this is about science. This is about people looking at charts and saying, like, where did this disease spread through? And was that a different strain? And where did it come from? And what's the number of times one person contacts another person? And how does that disease affect your body? And so then what kind of drug would affect that? That's just science. It's not somebody's opinion. And it's not, I read it on the internet. And that's what climate change is. Like, these are just models that are predicting out what's going to happen. And, that's no different than what a pandemic model tells us, and that we ignored as a country. We weren't allowing sort of good science to say, like, ooh, somebody's bound to come from China to the West Coast, and it's probably there. And if we only had the kind of testing, anyway, now I'm on another rant, but I'm glad your students are observing that. And let's face it, our whole hope right now is based on students and young people. And I just love the way that they are, they're paying attention, they're staging their own protests. They're saying, wait a minute, if climate change is real, then this is me, this is when I'm grown up, and this is what'll happen to my kids, so maybe you adults can ignore it, but we can't, and thank goodness for them. So thanks for those ideas. That's good to know.
Is there anybody else that would like to unmute themselves and ask a question?
I'd love to hear from any of you, if you want to share. I think you guys, I already thought you had a really hard job. So I mean that. I'm not just like pandering to teachers because you're there, because it's too late to get a good grade from you guys anyway. So, but I can't even imagine how hard this is. I have grandchildren, and when I'm not in quarantine, I get to hang out with them a little bit, and I see, they have capable parents, but it's so stressful. And I know, like, for my 7-year-old grandson, it's not the same watching a teacher remotely as for my 3rd grader granddaughter who can sit down and do her work. And I can't imagine what it feels like for you guys who, care deeply about your students. You got to figure out all these creative ways to get to them, and then you can't see everything. Like, how are you surviving?
Well, we meet with our kids every Monday, Wednesday, Friday. First of all, thank you very much for coming in and sharing your time with our little social studies family. We appreciate you coming in and hanging out with us for the morning.
Sure.
And I'll be leaving early because I have a class to get to. So it really, for me, is helpful to check in with the kids on Zoom and to be able to just connect with them and see how they're doing. And for me, that social emotional connection is what's most important right now. And the content comes secondary to that for me. So my focus has been on checking in with the kids. I offer 2 different meetings with parents on Mondays, 2 different times, so they can come in, and they've really appreciated being able to just come and, I don't know, share their stories and hang out and be in a space with other people. But definitely miss the kids, and I tell them that every time I see them. I tell them first of all, I teach middle school. I tell them I don't miss their annoying behaviors, but I do miss them. And it's true. I said, I miss seeing you kids. But when we Zoom with them, they act like they do in the classroom. And I'm like, hey, put your cell phone down, please. Just for 30 more minutes. I need you for 30 minutes. Put the phone down. And they're like, ah. So it's a great way for me. And I know that a lot of teachers are doing that too. My question originally, when I was muted, thank you, Joe, for unmuting me, really quickly, or not. My question is, and it's connected to you asking about the kids. I think it was really good how you shared your story. It makes you real. And I think that's been helpful for me as an adult to see you as a real person. And I think it'd be really good for the kids to get that information too. So I wondered, you talked about going into the classrooms. Like, when you go, do you go just to schools in your area? I teach in Auburn. I teach 7th and 8th grade. I think it is super valuable for the kids to hear from our legislators, in real time as real people, so that they can make those connections to see that you're not just a suit somewhere else, but that you are somebody who, you said you weren't a great student. Well, I mean, the kids would love to hear that. So I don't know if there's a question in there, and I don't know what it's going to look like or when we're going to go back or what that will look like, but do you go into the classrooms? How do you do that? And maybe considering Zoom?
Yeah. No, it's great. I mean, if any of you ever want me to visit your classroom by Zoom, or when we're ever actually, back in the real world, I'm happy to do it. Sometimes we get too busy and we have a hard time filling it in, but I have to say, Zooming with the classroom, and we even did a few of these prior to all this, in a rudimentary way, but now it's going to be standard fare. Everybody's going to do it. And I'm happy to do that anytime. And you can just, you can talk to my office, or you can just email me. My email is Chellie@Pingree.com. So if you can spell my name, Chellie@Pingree.com, just send me an email. I'll forward it to my office, and we'll figure it out. And if it's in Jared's district, I'll just drag Jared along, or I'll just ask him if it's okay. Because, I mean, with only 2 representatives, we're not very protective about where the boundary line is all the time, and we work together really well. So that's no big deal.
I'd love it if you could drag Jared along. That would be great, because then there would be the 2 of you there sharing your story. So
yeah, we have really different stories, and but we share a lot of the same,
awesome.
challenges in doing the job. So of course, and I wish there were easier ways to do that, because it is really hard to convey to people that you're not, you're not just this person who appears on TV, or you're not lumped into everybody else. You don't have the same story. But it's a little bit hard at times to have kids get to see what the world really looks like, or what people really look like. Sure. Thank you. Thanks for doing your job, especially middle school. Oh, pity the person who taught my son, but he's grown up now. He turned out okay.
They always do.
Yeah.
Did anybody else want to respond to Representative Pingree's Prom, she kind of wanted to know how you guys were doing or what you were up to. Otherwise, there is about a half dozen questions in the chat box as well. So Representative, I don't know if you want to hear from more people sharing their stories, if you want to take a question, or how you would like to move forward.
Anything's fine with me.
Right. I will give everybody a second if somebody wants to chime in.
I will say yesterday, hi Chellie, I'm Bree, I teach in Thompson at Mount Arrett High School. I had a Zoom session with my seniors in my AP US Government course, and I thought we would have like maybe a little half an hour chat about the AP Gov exam, which is coming up on May 11th. But it was absolutely, they were just so happy to see each other's faces in the squares. We talked about absolutely nothing having to do with AP Government. They just miss each other so much and are trying to figure out like, how do we have a prom? How do we have a graduation? How do we pick what school we want to go to when we can't visit the schools? And then after we chatted, there was, I think, 10 of us. The 2 who got into Bowdoin, I'm a Bowdoin alumna, the 3 of us stayed in the chat to talk about how the Bowdoin connection and that they both are going to be able to make it work. And I just miss them so much.
I bet.
It's just a really hard time to be away from them.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. I think people don't, you know, we have such misconceptions of everybody's jobs. People think like, oh, teachers, so great. You get to stay home on the couch and watch Netflix. You know, you must be so glad to get away from the little monsters. And I know you guys care so much. And I think it's hard in the middle of this, you know, tragic episode to, you know, for people to have appropriate sympathy for seniors, but for their lives and their worlds. I mean, I just feel so bad, especially high school seniors. I just feel like, oh my God, you build up your whole life to get to this year and you've got it all planned and you got all these relationships with your friends and it's just gone and you don't get to do it again, you know, like I just feel really bad. So, and I'm sure you feel really bad for them. And so at least it's nice they got to all kind of see each other on your screen.
Yeah. The idea that like the last time I saw them is going to be the last time I see them.
Oh,
that's really hard.
Yeah, that's terrible. Well, they will never forget this year of their lives, that's for sure. But hopefully not feel too traumatized by it.
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
So I just want to chime in. Maybe I'll speak for some other people. Hi, I teach 3rd grade in Ellsworth. This is what gets me through. I meet with my kids. I have, I call them office hours, but it's just like check-ins every day for my kids and their parents to come in. Yesterday, I had an hour-and-a-half Zoom with one of my students and her mom, and it was the most like refreshing thing to just be and have like a nice casual conversation checking in. Over the weekend, I went to every one of my students' houses and put up signs on their door that just said, my teacher misses me. And dropped off, it was after lunchtime, so I dropped off like juice boxes and snacks for my students and all their siblings. And then it's this, like if I'm not doing stuff with my kids, it's coming into the Zooms and there's a small group of us, we're all like here. And it's just being able to find out what other people are doing. We're all feeling the same way. And just diving, like kind of not really facing the real world, but still at the same time facing it and just being here with other people that feel so defeated, but at the same time, not.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's so hard. That's so sweet that you visited everybody's home. I bet that was really exciting for them.
It was nice because some of them came out and then some like stuck their head in the door or the window and they like blew kisses and did air hugs. And, you know, like there were some people that really, like all the families loved it. There were other teachers that were like, why are you doing that? And so I just kind of made the comment of, well, maybe you need to relook at your class culture and environment if you're not comfortable with that. Like that's just the bond that I've made with my students and my families, because I am wholeheartedly like, that comes first. If you don't have that bond and that culture with your families, then you're not going to have anything else for the rest of the school year. Like you just,
that makes so much sense.
You just don't, you won't have it.
Well, I should say when you know, talking about how politicians don't seem like real people. So when we are in DC, we have to stay, in an apartment somewhere. And I live in a building when I'm in DC that has several female members of Congress, several members of Congress. And we've gotten to be, pretty good friends because we're in the elevator, we see each other and we work together. So we have a text chain of about maybe 15 of us. And it's sort of one of the same things that keeps all of us going. You're following problems that people have, this didn't work out for this meeting, this didn't work out. Or people send, just as stupid a jokes as teenagers would on the text chain, or, little pictures of their homemade mask. And once or twice a week, we literally get on Zoom, drink a glass of wine together and just kind of complain. And it's like, hey, this is just like the rest of America. Like, we just have to have some kind of human ability to stay in touch with each other and to have the idea that, there's somebody else out there that you can talk to about what it's like. Because all of us are in sort of unique professions that sometimes only the other people who do what you do know what it's like or can help you figure out what's challenging about it. So we're pretty much the same.
Representative, I know that we had talked about like an hour time slot. I don't know what your schedule is or is not, or what you're willing to do. I know we'll probably start losing people.
Sure. I just have a few more minutes. I have to get on another call, I guess, right after 10. So.
Okay. There's a handful of questions. I'll kind of put them out there and let you talk about whichever ones you would like. There's a question about how is Congress working during this crisis? Has partisanship been an issue, or does it seem to kind of be a little bit different now? There's a question around like how this might continue into the fall, and what are your thoughts on education kind of moving forward? There's a question about civil liberties versus stay at home, and how do you balance that? There's a question around this has clearly changed election cycles and campaigning, and do you think that will change going forward? And then there's a question about the popular vote versus electoral college. So you've got partisanship, you've got schooling, you've got civil liberties, you've got campaigns, and you've got electoral college. Any of those would you like to tackle? Otherwise, I'm sure we could get somebody else to tell you how much they miss their kids as well. So.
I love that part. Well, I can give you a few just quick answers. I am a supporter of a movement to eliminate the Electoral College. We're done with that. It doesn't make sense anymore in many ways. I understand some of the values of it, but I'm ready for it to be done. It focuses too much attention on too few states and doesn't kind of equalize our democracy in the way it should. I'm worried about the elections. I'm very worried about the elections. I was talking to one of my colleagues last night from Wisconsin. There's already 52 people who have tested positive from their requirement that basically people went out to vote. There are people who are still receiving their absentee ballots like yesterday because they were so poorly prepared. I think every state should be prepared to vote by mail. We don't know what it will be like, and dragging people to a polling place at this moment in time is ridiculous. And anyway, vote by mail gives people another option. Partisanship is hard to predict or hard to tell. Honestly, just one quick thing about that. There is much more coming to agreement within members of Congress than you would think or see on cable TV, because it's kind of the job of sort of the news to find our conflict. That said, it's the most difficult administration to work with of all times, and that's true for the Republicans and the Democrats. So I have a lot of good Republican colleagues, wonderful Republican colleagues who I work together, we get a deal, we figure something out, and they hear from the White House it's a no-go. So even though we're trying to work together as well as we can to get through this horrible crisis, it's still hard. That's still hard. But that said, we've managed to put out more than $2 trillion in aid, which would have been unthinkable 6 months ago because we couldn't have gotten ourselves to agree on a $100 million bill. But that's a real sign that people have come together and said, this is a crisis and we're gonna do unprecedented things. We're just gonna pour money into the economy in ways that, we would have had all kinds of partisan and ideological disagreements with, but people know like there's no other way out here. We have to do this. And one other I remember is the civil liberties thing. That's probably, I think the, governor is doing a good job, but I would say it's a really, really hard job. And even yesterday or the day before, whenever she came out with the guidelines for moving forward, they were just bound to make, half the people really mad, and half the people are saying, oh, we can't have 2-week quarantines, we'll never get tourists. And half the people are saying like, oh my God, I'm a hairdresser and you want me to go back to work Friday, these people aren't safe. I'm not leaving my house. So, you know, this is an unprecedented, really tough time. And yes, of course we have civil liberties, but you know, we don't let you drive as fast as you want to on the highway. We have all kinds of things where we say, for the safety of others, you can't be drunk in your car. We don't say like, oh, go ahead, you're only going to kill yourself. Well, you're not. You're going to kill 5 other people when you wiggle all over the road because you're not sane enough to drive at that moment in time when you're drunk. So I think that, you know, it's going to always be an American argument, but if we cling too hard to that and say like, oh, if we lose our freedoms, you know, we'll never be America. And, you know, and it's your grandmother or your teenager who gets the disease, which is a horrible, horrible disease that you can easily die from. Like, what did you achieve by being able to say like, I'm not going out with a mask on? You know, you know, at some point it's like, that's when the governor has to be the teacher, the mom, the parent, and just say like, I know you guys don't like this, but you know, I've looked at all the data, I've looked at all the science, and this is about everybody's safety, not just like your individual, this is what I want to do. I'll say one last funny thing about, I was talking to a colleague from Michigan, and they had one of the first, you know, kind of big protests, and people came out with guns and, you know, just were like, I want all my liberties back. And the 2 things that people wanted most were elective surgery and being able to go to the hardware store and do construction. And to tell you the truth, those are the 2 things that we're opening up first, because there is kind of a pathway forward to, if your hospital isn't overwhelmed, you can have some other surgeries in there. And Maine never shut down hardware and garden stores, which I think was good, because for a lot of people stuck at home, they want to do it yourself project and be out in the garden. So, you know, those are like reasonable requests, but you didn't have to storm the Capitol about civil liberties. I mean, they didn't, what I'm trying to say is people weren't really trying to demand, you know, that they could have a cruise ship on the, you know, Lake Michigan or something. You know, it wasn't like crazy. So anyway, that was as many questions as I can remember that you asked, but I really appreciate you guys giving me your time and hearing from you and just seeing what's on your mind.
Do you have any closing thoughts or anything you would like for the group, Representative?
No, I mean, you know, I just thank you all. I think I've said it a couple of times that, you know, I admire teachers every day. You work so hard, you take a lot of risks yourselves. You put yourself in tough positions between, you know, policies and planning and dealing individually with kids and families, and kids' lives are harder now than they ever were before. And you have to juggle all that. So I'm just really grateful. And I think that, you know, I hear nothing but amazing thing about teachers during this difficult time. I hear from parents and, you know, families all over the place that you're all doing this great work of staying in touch and figuring out creative ways. And I happened to be, my granddaughter was visiting me a couple of weeks ago, and her teacher they were practicing for a musical, and it was like kindergarten through 5th grade. And it was just, I just had a hard time just not like sobbing through the whole time listening. You know, she was over here on Zoom and I was sitting over here. The music teacher is just doing this amazing job of like trying to get each kid to sing their part, and they're all on Zoom, and they're just little kids, and they have like these crackly, horrible voices, and nobody seems to get the tune right. And she just keeps saying like, so good, so great. And, you know, now we're going to put it together, and now we're going to make a trailer and send it home to your parents. And then at the very end, she has to say like, oh, well, I have to tell you now, we're going to cancel the musical, but we're going to be so well prepared for next fall. And all these kids are like, you know, wait, we're practicing, you know, and I'm just thinking like, you're handling their disappointment. You're, you know, you're trying to teach them when they're, you know, they're just little squares on the screen. And it couldn't have been any sweeter. And it just meant so much to all these kids. So that's what you guys do every day.
Awesome. Well, thank you again. And Representative, there's a lot of thank yous in the chat box from everybody in the group. And you'd mentioned you've got a 10 o'clock call. So thank you for giving up an hour of your time and answering all of our questions. And people are just mentioning how much they love just your authenticity and the stories that you shared. So thank you for that. So I think you've got this, this group can vouch for, yes, just keep being you and everything else.
All right. Well, thank you very much. And let me know if I can help any of you or anything you need in your classrooms or anywhere else. So thanks so much. Be safe. Take care.